Hello people. Today is probably one of the biggest challenges I've faced recently, and you are going to face as well. It's you're going to make bread, and it's sourdough starter bread. So before you can actually start your bread making, you have to make your sourdough. This is a totally new experience for me, so we're going to go along this path together. So I'm going to start with a sourdough starter recipe and then carry on for the bread making recipe. Today we're going to make sourdough bread, and the quantities below make 2 loaves because it's pointless making one when you can do 2 at the same time. It's hard work, but it's well worth it in the end. The sourdough bread freezes really well and it refreshes really well as well. So give it a try, okay? Your ingredients are 800 grams of bread flour. That can be white flour. I would advise using wholemeal or whole grain because it's more interesting and it's healthier for you. 450 millilitres of tepid water, that's warm, not cold, not boiling. 10 grams of salt or 2 teaspoons full. 320 grams of sourdough starter, and sourdough starter is going to feature as a separate item. You need that to make this bread, so you have to start there. I'm going to do them as separate recipes though, because they're going to be too long otherwise as one, and what I'm trying to do is keep them all under 15 minutes for you. Okay, so today sees the culmination of all that sourdough starter story, and we're going to make some bread. So you need 800 grams of strong flour. I'm using wholemeal flour with grain in because I like that. You need 10 grams of salt, 460 millilitres of tepid water, so not boiling hot, just warm. You need 320 grams of the sourdough starter and a very large bowl. I put my bowl on my weighing scales and set it to 0, and I'm just about to add the flour. Grams of flour in there now, and I'm going to set it back to 0 for the next ingredient. I'm going to add 10 grams of salt, which is 2 teaspoonfuls of salt. Salt is the essential ingredient in this recipe. I've set my scale back to 0 again, and I'm now going to add the sourdough starter. This is what it looks like now. That's 8 days of feeding the sourdough starter, and that comes under a separate video, so you can make that yourselves. So you don't need yeast, the sourdough is the thing. This recipe is enough for 2 loaves. Sourdough bread freezes really well and refreshes really well out of the freezer. So there's the sourdough starter going in. Johnny's going to help with this one today, so I'm going to tell him to stop when it's 320 grams. Now, what you don't see at this point is the fact that I hadn't set the scale back to 0, so the 320 became God knows what, and we ended up pouring some of the sourdough starter off. The sourdough starter's in there, and finally 460 millilitres of tepid water. Okay. Now I've got to get my hands in there to mix it up, so I'll do that now before Johnny takes over for the kneading. So bearing in mind that we've got too much sourdough starter in there, if you listen carefully you can hear Mark say pour it all in about the water. So we're starting off with a bit of a wet mix. So Johnny's mixing it all up for me. I tell you, what's really good for this is actually a glue spreading spatula, because that's what most bakers use. So Johnny's trying to bring it together now because oh, it's coming together quite nicely actually, Johnny. Well done there. Keep going, Johnny, keep going. Okay, so it's all come together now, and the idea is Johnny's going to push this out onto the table. We're actually going to use the living room table for this one. So he's got to put it out on the table, and then he's got to start kneading it. You can hear me starting to giggle in this one because it's just so funny. It's just so sticky. Now, this bit's really messy and gooey, but apparently you shouldn't put any more flour on because it'll just keep taking and taking and taking the flour, which will make your bread really hard. So Johnny Darling has to knead it until it's quite smooth. As you can see, it's very, very messy and gluey now, but with the kneading, it'll all come together, we hope. Mark's been kneading it for about 7 to 8 minutes. There is no time scale on how long you have to knead it. You have to knead it until the gluten starts becoming supple and waxy, and something called the window pane effect, which I'll show you when we get to that stage. So keep on kneading. Mark's arm's hurting now, so but he's going to carry on. Miracle of miracles, it did actually knead in the end, but it's still too wet, but we carried on anyway. So there it is now, all kneaded. It's all nice and elasticy, and if you pull a lump off and you hold it up to the light, it should be like a window pane. It shouldn't be just like a piece of broken glass. I put some ordinary flour in the bottom of the bowl, and it's going to rest in that to prove for 3 hours. So I'm going to cover it over with a tea towel and just leave it anywhere really. I'm leaving it in the dining room because we've got the fire on there. It doesn't have to be anywhere warm because sourdough works differently to yeast. So we'll come back to that in 3 hours. So I've put the other half of the dough onto a lightly floured surface. I'm going to put some olive oil onto my hands, just a tiny drop so that the dough doesn't stick to me. Just about that much. Just going to wipe it in my hands so it doesn't stick, as I said. And I'm going to do what's called knocking it back. So basically you just bring it all in on itself like that. So you're trying to get all of the air that's gone in there out of it, because it's going to then have a second proving and it's going to rise again. Oh, that was quite biblical then. Right, so as you can see, I'm going to scrape the flour to the middle, and what you're going to do, you're going to just push it in on itself, turn it, push it, turn it, push it, turn it, push it, and turn it, push it, and so on, so it's all gone in itself. And then you can just, oh, I'm going to do that again because it's not quite right there, so keep pushing it in and turning it. You can be quite rough with it. As I said to Mark earlier, just imagine it's somebody you hate and just punch the lights out of them. So I'm going to put a little bit more flour on the table. Oops. There you can see, I'm just sort of pushing it in at the bottom because what it'll form is just a natural round. There you go, that's it. Then in my next basket, which is a little bread basket, I've lightly dusted it with flour so that it doesn't stick to the tea towel. Popping it in there. Then a very light dusting on the top so that it doesn't stick to the tea towel. Cover it over. So that's the second one done now. All nice and cutched up, snuggled up, ready for the proving overnight. Okay, so I've the bread has had the first 3 hours of proving. So I've knocked it back, that is to knock all the air out of it, and then I've kneaded it a little bit and sort of turned it round on itself. Because mine's going to be sort of a rustic one, I have put into a bread basket a serviette which I've floured, And now that I've formed the bread, I'm going to pop that in there, cover it over with a serviette, and do the next one. I've just given it a fine coating of flour so that it doesn't stick to the serviette. Then I'm just going to cover it over gently like that, as if I was putting it to bed. And then we are going to wait overnight for that to prove and see how it looks in the morning. Now I've let my bread or my dough rest overnight in these little parcels, and lo and behold, it has risen up, and now we can be ready to go to the oven to bake. So the oven's on now, warming at 240 degrees. It needs to be very hot, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with those next. I've turned the bread out now onto a baking tin. The oven's warming. I've scored the top. This was a traditional way of identifying your bread in the communal ovens of days gone by. I'm going to put it into the oven for about 30-35 minutes with a tray of hot water. The hot water helps the bread rise, again, because for the first 10 minutes of cooking it will continue rising, and it gives it a nice soft crust. So into the oven it's going to go now. Now at this point what you don't see is us running out of gas. We have bottled gas here, there's no town gas. So the bread half cooked, then Mark had to run out and get a bottle of gas, and then it continued cooking. But it did turn out, so I treated it as pre-cooked, half-cooked bread, and then give it another 20 minutes, and this is the result. There are the loaves now just out of the oven, just waiting for them to cool down before I slice them to show you what the inside looks like. There it is, I've just cut the crust end off, and you can see it's got a nice crumb or mix in it, so I'm probably going to taste that in a second. The last photo is our egg mayo sandwich for lunch. The bread is absolutely delicious, and I've actually used a half of the recipe today to make it properly so that we have the right quantity of sourdough starter in there, just to see how that looks out. So I'll put a photo of that on my Facebook tomorrow. So enjoy. It was a challenge, but it was well worth it. So please try that one.